Hi listeners and welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So, by the very nature of these podcasts, we always do something that we haven't done before. Like, of course, this really feels like something we haven't done before.
This is something we haven't done before and something I suspect listeners haven't done before. So, listeners, come with us on this journey.
So we're doing The Batwoman, which is a 1968... Now, I'm not even going to say the word adaptation, though that might be appropriate. I'm also not going to use the word remake, because that also might not be appropriate. But a Mexican, quote-unquote, version, let's say, of the Batman mythology, and in this case, focusing in particular on the Batwoman. We've just had a very intense pre-recording debate around the difference between Batwoman and Batgirl, which we may or may not get into. So this is a 1968 Mexican film that has been chosen by our guest, who I will introduce shortly. But obviously, there's things to say about the relationship between, I guess, genre and fantasy and the role of superheroes, which, Alex, you're kind of interested in. There isn't an abundance of kind of effects, but there are kind of practical effects, of course, as part of as we will get into, and gloriously so. And so, and I think there's something interesting around why it is that the Batman or the Batman world is something that's so rife for these kinds of adaptations, versions that move across different national boundaries. So I will have some things to say, certainly not as much as our guest, and probably not as much as you.
Oh, I don't know. I think
you love your superheroes.
I love my superheroes. I love my creature features, but I didn't know I was going to be watching one of them till about half an hour into this movie. I love my James Bond movies, and I felt like I was watching one of them at some point.
Yes.
I've got listeners, Google the movie, give it a quick glance, then come with us, because I think there's so much we can unpack here and demystify. And hopefully our guests will be able to do that, because I'm not sure I'm going to be able to.
Yes. So we're delighted to welcome Dr. Iain Robert Smith, who is a senior lecturer in film studies at King's College London. His research interests include transnational cinemas, global Hollywood, popular cinemas of Asia, adaptation and remakes, and cult exploitation and horror cinema too. His work focuses largely on the ways that material is adapted across different national contexts, including interrogating what happens when Hollywood movies are adapted and remade by other cultures. These questions were central to his monograph, The Hollywood Meme, Transnational Adaptations in World Cinema from 2016, and his later co-edited collections, Transnational Film Remakes from 2017, and Media Across Borders. Iain was the co-founder of the SCMS Transnational Cinemas Scholarly Interest Group over 10 years ago, and co-investigator on the AHRC-funded research network Media Across Borders. And he's also interested in restoring films, which we will hopefully hear more about at the end. As I said, he selected the film for this episode. So Iain, after a long while wanting to get you on, we finally got you on. Thank you for joining us to talk about the Batwoman.
No, thank you. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about this
film.
So
So before we get into the film, and before we kind of, I suppose, situate it in relation to your research, it would be good to hear about your research and what is it, or how you got into these kinds of movies. Because whenever I think students come to us to talk about or are interested in these kinds of films, you're the person that we always sort of...
And perhaps you can also just give a little bit of explain what these kind of films are.
Yes,
I suspect some people don't know about these kinds of films, and they must know about them by the end of this show. Because so take it away.
Definitely one of the kind of core interests that I have is in these, unlicensed kind of transnational adaptations. So things like, I started on this journey with a film called Tourist Omer in Star Trek. So this is a Turkish film, 1972, in which this kind of comedy character, Tourist Omer, who in previous films, he's a kind of bumbling character from kind of rural Turkey who goes into Istanbul, the big city, and then in subsequent films he goes to other countries, and it's filled with kind of national stereotypes. But in the seventh film, he goes to Star Trek. And so the Turkish filmmakers have recreated an episode of Star Trek, added in elements from other episodes, and then added in lots of comedy, because he's kind of making fun of Spock, making fun of all the other characters. So I kind of, during my master's, like way back, this is maybe 2005, something like that, I'd happened upon that film alongside the Turkish reworking of The Exorcist, the Turkish Star Wars. Initially was just doing that as a master's kind of coursework essay. And then realized, hang on a minute, there's something really fascinating here. Like, people talk about the kind of global power of Hollywood and the way it's distributed around the world, and it's often talked about as being American cultural imperialism or Coca colonization. Like there's all these McDonaldization, there's all these terms that describe the US's cultural power. And I was really interested, but actually, how are these industries around the world making use of those Hollywood films? And what are the politics of that process? Like on one level, they're imitating US pop culture. So in some ways, maybe that's giving in to US kind of cultural hegemony. On the other hand, there's an element of resistance. They're kind of taking elements from those films. They're making use of them without any copyright licensing. They're localizing them, making their own versions. I'd started off with films like the Turkish reworkings of Star Trek and The Exorcist, but then slowly built from there to then be looking at films made in the Philippines, in India, and in Mexico, like this Batwoman film.
I think, to be clear for listeners who haven't watched this or any of the other texts. Well,
it works perfectly with Toy Story.
We're not talking about adaptation. Like, this is not a film set in Gotham City this is a film. We're going to get into the plot details in a minute. Please, blow by blow, because I'm excited to talk about that. But this is a film very much using a kind of IP, a character, even just a sort of an iconography, and transplant it to its more local setting. I think final question, then we're going to get onto the film itself. I think one of the things about your work that always fascinates me is this, so these are unlicensed, and I think it gets onto the politics and the resistance politics of kind of doing this unlicensed. But there's also something really kind of satisfying about kind of the areas where this unlicensing is either allowed or not noticed by the Hollywood machine. We're perennially seeing kind of, newspaper cuttings where Disney are suing some local nursery in rural Surrey because they've painted Mickey Mouse on the back and things like that. Yeah. But these are spaces in the kind of film history, in the film calendar, in the film global kind of sphere where these things are just happening, and either I'm assuming the studios probably do know about it by now and seem to not value these spaces enough to actually take them on, or they're managing to resist despite being taken on. So that's really interesting.
No, definitely. I think copyright is such a kind of important part of this story, because you get some films, like in the US there was a kind of exploitation film, The Wild World of Batwoman, the Jerry Warren film, which the filmmaker was sued for making use of the kind of DC property. He won the case because actually the film doesn't really make use much of DC and Batman at all. But I think the fact that they're kind of litigious within the US, and then industries around the world were able to be making use of kind of Hollywood films without any kind of licensing. I mean, Turkey is the kind of obvious example, because there were just hundreds of films being produced every year that were kind of reworking US properties, whether it's using the iconography, sometimes it's just using the actual music from those films. I mean, there's the film Turkish Star Wars, which has that name not because they're remaking Star Wars, but the director Çetin Inanç is actually using footage from Star Wars in his own film, along with music from Raiders of the Lost Ark, Battlestar Galactica, Flash Gordon. So that sense of just being able to kind of use these materials that are coming into the country for your own purposes without worrying about copyright licensing, I think that's part of the kind of fascinating story that they tell.
Theorists of comic cultures and superhero franchises and things often talk about these things as mythologies, and as kind of almost like a kind of example of kind of folk storytelling, right? Doesn't matter, that kind of culture of IPs that really exist. It's about shared heritage and archetypes, and using and reusing and reappropriating and all this kind of stuff. But in a way, this seems far more, that when they talk about it, they often talk about it in relationships, Tim Burton's Batman versus Chris Nolan's Batman versus Adam West's Batman, all this kind of stuff. But this seems much more like in keeping, where it's that just sense of a culture whereby the rules are let loose and let's play with these ideas and things like that. And this is a movie that definitely is doing that. So I've never asked this question so loaded before. What is the Batwoman? And what's its story?
In terms of the plot?
Oh, good question. Let's start. No, good point. Let's start with. Should we start behind the scenes? Should we start with how on earth this came to be, and then we'll worry about what it is?
Well, and only because it seems you sent us something to kind of look at ahead of time about something you've written on Batsploitation, and it seems like Batman, the world of Batman, the Batman mythology, amongst many other particular kinds of genre films, are the ones that either seem to do quite well, or maybe they're just conducive to these sorts of kind of remaking working processes. So this Mexican film comes in a long line of Batsploitation films, could we call them?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's part of this kind of global kind of Batmania in the kind of mid '60s. I think. After the kind of the Adam West TV series. Was hugely popular, including the film,
which was '66, right? So this is 2 years. Fine.
So this is 2 years afterwards. But you're also getting films in the Philippines, like Batman Fights Dracula, Fight Batman Fight, James Batman.
That's the one. And what's that one about?
So James Bond and Batman team up to fight crime in Manila.
There you go.
And played by the same actor. It's Dolphy, who had been playing James Bond in a couple of parodies.
Great.
So there's a lot. So this the Batwoman is part of a quite intensive, quite well established filmmaking tradition, not just in the Philippines, but the US, of course, and you send your chapter kind of Turkey and Mexico as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so 73, you've got a Turkish film based on Batman, but we've also got Mexico. It's basically all the kind of popular film industries around the world were doing some variation of this, kind of either kind of parodying or paying homage to, or just kind of borrowing elements from Hollywood films. So you're seeing it in Brazil, in Mexico, but you're also seeing it in Italy, in the Philippines, in India, like all over the world. Any kind of industry that was producing a kind of volume of films, kind of, I guess, kind of quickie kind of production style, would have some element of borrowing from Hollywood. And Batman, the huge popularity of Batman in the mid '60s. Then means that loads of industries are then deciding, okay, well, let's do our own version of Batman.
Okay, so let's move in on the Mexican context. So what's going on in the Mexican film industry at this point that we need to know about to understand this movie a bit better?
Well, I'm always fascinated by how these films are kind of, I guess, localizing or adapting it to the kind of specific local industry. And I think one of the main things around Batwoman is that this is it's a lucha libre film. It's a wrestling film. It's taking the iconography of Batman. It's taking the mask. It's taking the costume, but now, of course, she's in a bikini. But then adapting it to a kind of lucha libre kind of wrestling format.
That's a genre. That's
okay.
So
give us that give us that. What's that?
so many tangents. Not even tangents, just avenues to go down.
So those are kind of Mexican wrestling films. So people like El Santo and the Blue Demon were hugely popular wrestlers. Like, people would go into Mexico City, watch them in an arena. And then there was a period from about 54, 55 where people couldn't watch wrestling on television. The government had kind of clamped down on that. So the only way they could watch wrestling was to see it in films.
Okay.
Or to go to the arena and watch it live.
Take that, censors.
And so,
because the film, it's fictionalized, or
I think
because it's filmed?
I think it's partly the idea that they're worried about the influence on kind of young people in the home. I think there's also a class element to it as well.
Okay.
So you then get this kind of huge number of kind of wrestling films that will mix with other genres, so that all this kind of Santo films are kind of fantasy horror with kind of vampires and Dracula and Frankenstein make an appearance. But then the films are then broken up. Like, every 20 minutes or so, you'll then just get a wrestling sequence.
Yes. I'm familiar with that, having watched this today. Yeah.
So it's almost like watching a musical or something. The kind of narrative is paused, and you're now getting like kind of 5-minute sequence of just watching a wrestling match. And it's a slightly kind of unusual format when you kind of first encounter it, and I think part of it is from that sense that audiences were not being allowed to watch this on television, so the pleasure of actually getting to watch wrestling and the sense that maybe this is something we're not supposed to be watching, that then feeds into what the films are doing.
Okay, cool. That helps. Right. So tell us about some of the main players in this. Do we know anything about the producer, the studio, the director, the stars? Who are the people that we're watching here, and what do we need to know?
So I did notice Bob Kane was, certainly on IMDb, is listed as a writer, I think. Obviously there's the issue of unlicensed, but then I saw Bob Kane and thought, who
is the original creator of Batman, or one of them?
So many questions.
I feel like the IMDb listing there is one of those ones where people have added that.
Sure.
It's not on the official credits, but it's like people are wanting to say, maybe he might have got some ideas from Bob Kane. Okay. So it's basically, there's a team. Guillermo Calderon is the kind of producer. He, his family had a hugely successful production company. Loads of the films that are currently being restored are from that studio, Calderon. But you've also got, Rennie Cardona as the director and Alfredo Salazar as the writer. The three of them just worked on so many kind of horror films, fantasy films, wrestling films. I think there's 6 female wrestler films that they did together. Doctor Doom and Wrestling Woman versus the Aztec Mummy, and the Batwoman is part of that kind of series where they see the huge popularity of the Santo films, and I think it's the grandmother of the woman who's restoring them just now, who suggested, these are very popular, but why don't we try Wrestling Women? Maybe there'll be an audience for that. A lot of the films that are being restored just now, like the Panther Woman, like the Batwoman, are from that female wrestler tradition.
Okay, I think we'll start going through the film in a second. I think I'm about to have a lot of fun with it because I had a lot of fun with the movie and I've got some things to say. But I wanted to start with just a note before we start, because I was trying to think about how to kind of, or how your experience of showing these movies, either to students or to the general public. I know you've done screenings of these sort of things. There is an instinct of how much laughter is part of the pleasure here, and how much things like schlock and camp or cult or all these kind of things. And I was struck watching the movie. There were bits in which I laughed out loud, either at a line of dialogue that, at least in the subtitling, was very clunky, or we'll get to the fish man, but just some outdated special effects. Obviously, the budget's not that big, so there's some fun things like that. But actually, I was struck. There's some incredibly innovative filmmaking going on here as well, and there's some really interesting. I'm sort of. I think I'm going to resist the idea that this is so bad it's good. I would just like to say this is a really good movie, in ways that might be different to other good movies. But how do you approach that? Is that because it seems to me that there's something going on about this desire to kind of laugh at things that isn't always necessarily positive, right? There's something quite subversive and fun about the kind of resistant spectator, but then also it's like, why are we laughing at this? What, because it's Mexican and it's not made with the same amount of money that a Hollywood film would have made? Because that's a bit pernicious. And what's your thoughts on all this?
No, I think that's a great question, and it's something that I've definitely struggled with in my research, because I kind of screen these films, I show clips at conferences, I put on events and festivals. And I'm often wary of that kind of so bad it's good response, because I do think these are genuinely great films. They're fascinating films. And so I'm always wary of that, the kind of condescending, people in London watching this film from Mexico in the late 60s and laughing at the shoddy special effects and laughing at this film as being bad. And I think, there's a sense in which that's true of so many of the kind of popular films from around the world, that they're kind of low budget. There's definitely a camp appeal to some of the style, the fashions, the performances, the excess of the films. But I think part of what I try and do in my work and in my teaching is to try and reframe the discussion away from it being so bad it's good, because I think the politics of that, definitely changed based on who is receiving the film as being so bad it's good, how are they receiving it, and what level of kind of mockery is there within that. I mean, it's something that one of the first bits of work I did in this area was for a Bond film made in the Philippines called For Your Height Only. The star is 3 foot tall. It's called Weng Weng.
Okay.
So this is a film that very much plays into exactly that tension. Like on the one level, people love that film, celebrate it, love Weng Weng. There's a director, Andrew Leavold, does a whole documentary all about his love for Weng Weng and searching him out and telling the story of the cinema from the Philippines. But also there's an element of mockery within a lot of that fandom, and kind of laughing at this star who's trying to be like Bond but can't be like Bond because of his height, because of being from the Philippines. And so, that's often something that I'm trying to kind of grapple with in my work, is the politics of that form of engagement that is, it's related to a concept I call cosmopolitanism.
Right, okay.
A kind of a cult engagement with cultures from around the world that's sometimes based around exoticism and kind of mockery and laughter at otherness, but on the other hand is about a kind of openness and an attempt to engage with films and cultures that are not your own. So I feel like that tension is there. But I think, unlike a film like For Your Height Only, which I think whenever I've screened that for people, I'm often slightly uncomfortable in how it's being received. I feel like The Batwoman is a film that it's just genuinely great film.
Yeah.
And even if it's fun and campy, like the Batman TV series was fun and campy, and we were laughing at it as much as...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think the film is certainly inviting a lot. It's hard to tell, obviously. I think you'll know better than we will, but I think it's good to acknowledge that tension, but I don't want us to turn into a kind of po-faced examination of this. I don't think the film asks for that either, right?
So we should do it. We're half an hour in.
Okay. I mean, right, fine. So let's kind of go... So because I've got enough to say about the first 5 minutes to just pause there. So the film sets up... We have a murder mystery. We have a kind of serial killer on the loose who is targeting wrestlers in particular. Yep. We'll find out why later, and it's a doozy of a reason. But he's targeting wrestlers, and there's been a series of murders of wrestlers. Yep. And the police, am I right, decide to call in Batwoman to try and solve this mystery. So a few things to note before we even get going then. So that setup... The first thing I wanted to talk about cultural specificity is that there is this interesting prologue where we get two policemen, and Batwoman is always working with versions of kind of police and detectives and things like that in this movie. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I noted that. But there's this line that's something like, well, these liberal newspapers, they're never going to get... We need someone tough who's going to sort of work beyond these kind of restraints. There seems to be something particularly Mexican culture specific about the need for a vigilante superhero that's a bit different from the American context here. Ian is nodding, everyone. So, Ian, take it away. What's going on there then?
I think you're exactly right that there's a kind of interest in these kind of strong, almost superheroic kind of figures in Mexican popular cinema at the time. And you get them in the kind of wrestling figures. So in some ways, El Santo is the kind of archetypal kind of figure who, he's a wrestler. He can go up and beat up all the criminals, beat up the monsters, and so there's often that kind of desire that we can't do this ourselves. We need to get Santo in to solve this mystery. And in this one, it's Batwoman who's the figure that's kind of arrives in a parachute to come and save them all.
It's quite Dirty Harry, like in a way, right? And I'm just interested it's happening in 1967, 68, whenever this film's made, rather than 10 years later in the American context. There's obviously a kind of right-wing individualism going on there that's probably speaking about the slippage between state effectiveness and social problems and things like that seems particularly kind of pertinent. Because the Adam West stuff it kind of downplays the kind of it's less interested in Batman as this vigilante than this film is, or at least at the start. But then she seems to work with the authorities throughout the entire movie, right?
Well, I was kind of interested in the superheroes and the character, the character of the superhero, and then the character of like the private detective in noir movies, which are sort of. This film gets on very quickly with the let's just get Batwoman in and just get on with it. Like, she's not bitten by a bat.
But does feel the need, interestingly, to explain who she is to the audience. We get like, oh, you don't know Batwoman. Batwoman is.
And then there's a kind of montage where she's really great at shooting and a great swimmer.
Yeah, horse riding.
Horse riding.
So is that assuming that some people might not know this character then, or might not know the character of Batwoman, like
Yeah, I think that's part of it, is to try and kind of orient the audience and get a sense of like, you're introducing, she's really rich, and so she's kind of got lovely dresses, but also she is amazing at sports, and she spends her time kind of fighting crime and wrestling. That seems to be her main kind of.
Yes, she's basically it's not completely different from the American character, right? But she is Mexican. I think that is important to stress, and likes wrestling on the other side. And there is a whole thing, I'm going to do it now because it's coming into my mind now. There's a whole thing about costume in this movie that I need to know either the production specifics or we need to riff on what on earth they're doing with it. But because she basically goes between about three or four different costumes in this movie. There's Batwoman in a kind of wrestling outfit where she most closely resembles the kind of Adam West character. Yeah. And that's where we get her wrestling, mainly. And it's a kind of full bodysuit stuff. As Batwoman, as in a cape, a bat sort of mask, and a bikini, which she spends about a quarter of the movie roaming around the streets in. And then also there are bits where she's not Batwoman, she's sort of unmasked as Batwoman. And that seems to be only bits involving the beach or the sea. And I suspect there are various different bodies inhabiting all these different people and things like that. But is there anything going on logistics as to why this is the case? Because it seems to be completely erratic from one scene to the next as to whether she's in a bikini, whether she's masked, whether she's not masked, or whether she's playing Batwoman or not.
No, that's a good question. I mean, for the wrestling scenes,
that makes sense.
That is, it's a wrestler who is in the kind of Batwoman outfit, so it's not the lead actress.
It's not impossible not to notice that, I must admit.
I think they do have a different kind of body shape, but certainly, I mean, it's a film that is as much part of that kind of Mexican exploitation cinema, Mexploitation sometimes called, where, the fact that she's in a bikini for much of the film is a big part of what's going to sell the film and draw in an audience. But of course, as with any of these kinds of films, there's that tension around the kind of sexual politics of that on the one hand, these films are clearly about kind of objectifying her and drawing an audience who want to see Batwoman in a bikini, but then also she's a very strong figure. She's the hero. She is not the kind of victim or someone that the hero is going to save. Like, she is very much the hero, and she has quite a lot of kind of strength and authority throughout the film. Like, she is the richest woman in Mexico.
Yes,
she is always like detective. Like, she is someone who she has a lot of agency and power, and so it's always an interesting tension within the film.
Doesn't like rodents though, does she?
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Yeah, and I think we'll tease out all that thread. I think because it's an interesting thing. I just wondered if there was anything going on in the production that I needed to know about, because there seems to be bits where there's bits where there's a main kind of, I forget the character's name because I always do, but there's the main kind of detective she works with.
Oh, that sounds right.
Okay. And then there is occasionally a sort of second detective who is introduced for a line of dialogue at one point, and then it feels like there might be something going. I don't know. Do you know anything about it, or am I just speculating wildly? But there seems to be almost like some characters that dip in and out and reappear and then disappear and are in for a sequence and then not in for a sequence, and it seems to be quite. Is there some stitching going on in the narrative that I don't know about?
I mean, I feel like it's fairly consistent with lots of other kind of Mexican popular cinema of that period, in that it's not necessarily stitching in the sense of they're kind of covering up issues or that they've got different narratives they're bringing together, but just that they're working a very low budget,
right?
And they're kind of trying to piece together a coherent narrative out of what they've been able to film.
Yeah, okay.
In a very short space of time, without a huge amount of kind of money and resources, and so there's various kind of inconsistencies in terms of how the characters are being presented and the costume, but I think it's something that I must admit that I feel I'm almost kind of blind to now because it's so consistent with all the other films that it's just like, oh yeah.
So do you mean stuff like production logistics? So like one day they can't get access to a particular location, or an actor's not available, or that kind of thing?
Exactly.
About,
right? So the kind of production logistics where they don't have access to that location, so they have to make do with what they've got. They've got to kind of rewrite elements on the roof.
Okay.
And so, there's lots of... I mean, part of my fascination with these films is that sense of something that's kind of handmade almost. While you're watching the film, you're aware that you're watching a film and you're thinking about the people on set making the film and the choices that they've made. Like that slippage between the filmic and pro-filmic where... I mean, you find it in loads of exploitation cinema, and for me, that's one of the fascinating elements. Is I can see the filmmaker on set and the choices that they're making, just watching the film itself. And so, I think that's part of it. Is there's loads of kind of inconsistencies. There's loads of elements where you're like, oh, why did they make that choice?
Yes.
Why didn't they do another take of that? Could they have got a better model for that element? But then, they're made very low budget, very quickly, and then that then becomes part of the pleasure.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try and use my words carefully because I don't want it to come across as like I'm patched, because I think I got that, like that, certainly sort of towards the end of the movie. We won't get there just yet, but there are various kind of episodic bits at the end where it almost feels like a kind of like the narrative almost feels like a kind of spontaneous, playful gesture, like, now this will happen, because that's the sort of thing you'd kind of create on the spot. Like there's a pleasure in kind of going along with the kind of the train's going down the track, we'll have to do a left turn instead kind of mentality that definitely comes across. Right, so
yes, well, no, so
go on.
I was just going to say I thought it was interesting the way that the film the film sets her up as this.
We're in minute 6 at the moment, or something like that.
Well, but in the way that there are two kinds, and I know we've spoken about this before, and actually to cite Will Brown again, there are these two kinds of superheroes: the super ones that pretend to be normal, and then the normal ones that pretend to be super, which is a good analogy for thinking about special effects. Anyway, so she, like the male Batman, is a multimillionaire who's just basically decided to dedicate her life to kind of fighting crime
and wrestling,
but also a terrific wrestler and has all these skills in a kind of montage, very Charlie's Angels-y. Also great at this and also great at this. But the film kind of introduces her, and this goes back to what I was saying about kind of private investigators, in the way that noir uses private investigators to be not quite kind of the public, but also not police. Kind of in the middle. And so that's how she exists. And I was also thinking about kind of the way that you have people like Sam Spade and these alliterative names. Sam Spade, but you also have Peter Parker. And so I was like, that's interesting that you have the superheroes that are neither one thing nor the other. They're kind of caught in between. And she's brought on as this sort of, I don't want to say the word kind of consultant, but she's like, this problem is so, and I think a couple of characters in the film say, it must be serious. If they've got Batwoman in, this must be a kind of serious issue. So she's a wealthy woman that can shoot, that can swim. It's
interesting she can shoot. That's the other thing, is that one of the skills she's identified with at the beginning is gun. And that was quite, because obviously that's very not Batman, right? Guns is not, but actually she doesn't really use guns in the movie, right?
She uses her compact that turns into a gun. So she's like checking her makeup and then it turns into a gun. But she's brought in because the body of this wrestler is found on the beach in Acapulco. A similar series of events have taken place in Macau and Hong Kong. So she is brought on to essentially solve why not only wrestlers, I really want to say this line, why these wrestlers are being killed, but why they believe that the killer is this kind of sophisticated scientist because these athletes, these wrestlers, pineal juice is being extracted surgically to essentially do something, which leads me to the line, quote, "We know little about the human body and less about this gland." So basically there's this mystery where
they're all dying by the sea, aren't they? They're all dying by beaches and in water. Yeah. Wrestlers love water, it would seem.
But their pineal gland is being kind of drained of this liquid. So far, so formulaic.
Yes.
Go on.
Well, no, I actually think you've missed something. They don't suspect. There's this evil scientist, right? What's he called? Dr. Do you remember Dr.
I do.
Academics Google Dr. Williams. Dr. Williams
and
lives
Igor, they're the two.
Who basically is sort of Carl Strongberg from The Spy Who Loved Me. Lives on a big boat.
I knew you were going to say that.
Big boat and is up to no good. But they don't suspect him. She suspects him. That's really important. They're like, oh, he's just a big marine scientist, loves fish. Famous recluse. Why do you think he might have anything to do with all these?
He's one eye patch away from that.
And she starts investigating this person, which
that's important.
Which, when it's important, because that means we have to do a lot of investigating in boats on the water, which means there's quite a lot of underwater sequences. Which brings me to my next point: 1960s underwater cameras were a thing. Discuss. So we're big Bond fans. Thunderball is 1965. Thanks, Chris. I nearly wrong dated it. 1965. If anyone hasn't seen Thunderball, about 50% of the movie is James Bond underwater. Yeah. There's obviously something in that here. The film wants to use this new gadget of the underwater camera because there's lots and lots of sequences that take place underwater. Yeah. Really, actually, much better than Thunderball because Thunderball's incredibly tedious because of it. But this manages to kind of be zippy and zappy and play with it.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. I mean, it has that kind of wonderful thing that popular cinema so often has, which is just the kind of desire to like make use of the kind of whatever the kind of new trend or new technology is, and to just be like, we saw this in that Bond film. Let's try that. Let's give that a go. And there's a kind of wonderful kind of joyfulness that you get from these films in that kind of appropriation of elements from Bond, from Batman, from wrestling films, and just kind of piecing it all together. So I think those underwater sequences are really wonderful, and it's one of the elements that has really benefited in this restoration.
I'll bet,
because so many of these kind of earlier copies would just look really kind of grainy and washed out, and so that you'd have huge stretches where you're not really clear on what's happening, and then now they look really quite wonderful.
But all this kind of the appropriation of these intertextual relations that this film has with other IPs and other characters, it's brought together, but there's a way of doing it where the outcome is Austin Powers or something. This is played. I mean, it's campy, but it's played absolutely straight, and that is to the benefit of the film, because then there is actual kind of jeopardy and drama. And it's good. I think it's good like that. Like it kind of hangs together in a way that it's not spoofing the source material, but it's taking it this is what we can do with it. And maybe that's part of, maybe that's how your kind of research fits in. It's what are some of these processes that are happening when products make that kind of move, or this material makes that move across these different boundaries. What are the politics? And it's not, the answer is not just they're just taking, it's not just play for laughs. It's not spoofing it. It's not parodying it, because there are plenty of those, and that's really easy to do. This is doing something a little bit more sincere actually with the material.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. Yeah, it's not playing it up as a kind of Austin Powers kind of spoof of Batman or spoof of Bond. Yeah. It's about taking those elements and producing a really kind of entertaining, kind of engaging film. And so I think part of the difference between this film and other films, like, so there are Brazilian films that are parodying Hollywood. So there's like a Brazilian Jaws that attempts to kind of make fun of the Hollywood film. And there's Robert Stamm's actually written a little bit about that film. and part of the problem he identifies in it is the sense that, yes, it's parodying Hollywood, but because of the low budget, because of the ineffective nature of its parody, you're not laughing at the Hollywood original, you're kind of laughing at the Brazilian film, and it's like that he kind of talks about it as parody has the possibility of being a resistant form of jiu-jitsu, like you're using the power of Hollywood against itself. You don't need to be strong yourself, you can use its power against it.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the laughter kind of rebounds off the film and ends up back laughing at the film. So I think, parody is often quite tricky in these cases because how successful it manages to be at parodying the Hollywood original then plays into its reception. Whereas, I think you're totally right that the Batwoman is not really playing it as a kind of parody. We're not kind of laughing at the use of these tropes from James Bond and Batman. We're just enjoying them. That we're taking pleasure in the way in which the film has kind of adapted and localized.
And cleverly
Everyone,
managed
it's
to
Alex here, just
mix
interrupting the
these things
podcast.
together.
for
I
a
think
moment.
play is the
Apologies,
right way.
we'll
It's
get
playing
back
with
to the
them.
scintillating
It's going,
conversation
okay,
in
let's
just a
have fun
second.
with that.
I'm
Let's
interrupting
enjoy
it with
that.
just a
Let's,
little bit of
let's see
admin
what
and a
we
little
can
bit of
do
a
with it.
plea
Let's,
to listeners,
let's throw
because
some
we need your help,
inspiration
frankly.
into it.
We have been running the podcast now for quite a few years. We're very happy running the podcast. We are thrilled by the amount of listeners we get. Always have been, always will be, and it's always growing, and it's always a really wonderful community out there. So thank you so much for listening. But the podcast doesn't do itself on its own. It requires Chris and I's time, and it also requires a bit of cash injected into it. I'm not asking for donations in this little plug here, but I am asking for your help to make sure we keep the podcast going on a financially sustainable and sort of time sustainable place. For example, right, there are hosting fees to pay. Okay, that's a couple of £100 each year. There's things like tech and cables. You might have heard a few episodes where Chris and I sound a bit echoey. That's because one of our cables broke and we had to find a way of replacing it and paying for it. And frankly, one of the things we're trying not to do is use our own money or our own pocket, our own wages, frankly, as full-time academics to pay for this stuff. We'd rather try and find alternative ways of funding it. Now, we have done that in the past and we'll continue to do that. We have no plans to introduce membership fees. We have no plans to start trying to sell you guys merch or asking you to go onto Patreon pages or anything like that. We want to keep this a free, easily accessible, educational resource which we're proud to produce and we're really pleased that we are producing. So all we need from you is just a little bit of more help in terms of helping us to showcase the value of this podcast to some of the people that might pay for it. Okay, so the way you can do this is like a couple of different ways. One, subscribe. Okay, if you're not already subscribed to the podcast on whatever platform you're downloading this from, please subscribe now. Those figures really help us. Second, review the podcast on any kind of platform, okay? A star review is helpful. Written reviews are even better, okay? If you haven't done one of them and you listen to our show and you think it's valuable, please take 3 seconds out of your day, just write a couple of sentences about what the podcast does for you, why you like it, and share that on the platform. That really, really helps. Third, share it with your friends. Share it on social media when you see a new episode being launched, okay? It helps increase the visibility. Hopefully more people can get it and access it too. That's really, really helpful. Finally, and this is a good one, this would actually be really, really helpful, is email us if you use the podcast in any kind of setting, okay? Whether you're an individual that just finds it useful, tell us why it's useful, particularly on an educational level. What have you learned from the podcast? What do you find that's valuable? What value has it brought to your life? Or what impact has it made on your life? I know that kind of sounds very lofty, but if you can just put the kind of simple, real-world changes that you've made, some things that how has it helped you approach the study of fantasy animation differently, anything like that, you can email us. That would let us know. If you're an educator and you use this podcast either to teach students or as part of your own research or as a way of inspiring further thought, let us know exactly how, some of the specifics. Maybe there's a course you have it subscribed to. Let us know. We know of some of you out there. We've worked with you in the past, but if you whether we've worked with you or not, please drop us that email. Really, really helpful. And you can do that at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Basically, we can fund this podcast through various ways through our own network, but what we need from you is evidence that the podcast is doing something out there in the world. It could be doing something small and sort of not very tangible, like helping you to enjoy fantasy and animation movies. Great, tell us how. That's really, really useful, but we need the evidence for it. Or it could be, helping teachers, helping practitioners? Are you a company out there that set it on your training session? Anything like that. We know of you people out there. We find you in various different ways, but it'd be really helpful if you could come to us so that we can gather that data as we approach another round of kind of scrape together some cash to keep the lights on. Okay, it's not much. Yeah, it only costs us I don't know, 400 or 500 quid a year to keep this thing going. We think we give a lot of time to the podcast. Hopefully you'll think that's a reasonable exchange. We give that time often outside our full-time jobs. We're just looking to kind of find ways of boosting our case to get the funding out there elsewhere. So no Patreons, no merch, I'm afraid. But if you could help us in those ways, share, subscribe, review, or email us with your stories, that would be very helpful. The email address again is fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Let's get back to the show.
This is doing something a little bit more sincere, actually, with the material.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. Yeah, it's not playing it up as a kind of Austin Powers kind of spoof of Batman or spoof of Bond.
Yeah.
It's about taking those elements and producing a really kind of entertaining, kind of engaging film. And so I think part of the difference between this film and other films, like, so there are Brazilian films that are parodying Hollywood. So there's like a Brazilian Jaws that attempts to kind of make fun of the Hollywood film, and there's Robert Stamm's actually written a little bit about that film, and part of the problem he identifies in it is the sense that yes, it's parodying Hollywood, but because of the low budget, because of the ineffective nature of its parody, you're not laughing at the Hollywood original, you're kind of laughing at the Brazilian film. And it's like he kind of talks about it as parody has the possibility of being a resistant form of jiu-jitsu, like you're using the power of Hollywood against itself. You don't need to be strong yourself, you can use its power against it.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the laughter kind of rebounds off the film and ends up back laughing at the film. So I think, parody is often quite tricky in these cases because how successful it manages to be at parodying the Hollywood original then plays into its reception. Whereas, I think you're totally right that the Batwoman is not really playing it as a kind of parody. We're not kind of laughing at the use of these tropes from James Bond and Batman. We're just enjoying them. That we're taking pleasure in the way in which the film has kind of adapted and localized.
And cleverly managed to kind of mix all these things together.
I think play is the right word. It's playing with them. It's going, okay, let's have fun with that. Let's enjoy that. Let's see what we can do with it. Let's throw some more stuff at it and see what we can do.
Because there are these. I mean, the first Casino Royale is only the year before
The spoof of James Bond.
So there are these things that exist, and if you're a spoof, you run the risk of going, well, that's just not funny. So this film kind of actually manages to, by not being a spoof or a kind of comic parody, it allows you to not judge the film on those terms by just not being funny.
It's not parodic. It's brazen. It's okay. We're going to go there. Okay, right. It's that's more of the response. That's more of the response I get from it. It's like, okay, let's also add this element to the plot. Why not?
Yes. So a question that kind of comes out this is that it seems like, and this goes back to something we talked about at the start. Why is it that there are so many fantasy movies and superhero movies? I mean, we've mentioned Bond, but it seems like fantasy movies in particular and superhero movies are just. Is it just because they're so recognisable they just lend themselves to these kinds of processes, or is there something that these films do because they're superhero movies? It just seems like a lot of these examples, Superman, Batman, Captain America, in the kind of Turkish context. So I just wondered.
Yeah, they're not riffing on the Magnificent Ambersons here. Yeah.
Renoir.
Exactly.
No, I think you're totally right. Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is the kind of instantly recognizable iconography.
Yeah.
So that when you've got Turkish filmmakers making a film like Uç Adam, The Three Mighty Men, it's Captain America teams up with Santo, so they've taken the character from Mexican cinema. They team up to battle an evil Spider-Man who's running a smuggling operation in Istanbul.
Classic.
And so, partly it's just like, oh, these are recognizable characters. We can get a costume for fairly not
just
a lot
need
of
the
money.
colours, roughly the colours.
Yeah.
There's enough suggestion there for it to be Spider-Man.
And so all of a sudden, you're not needing loads of budget, special effects. So like sci-fi is the challenge. Part of the reason the Turkish Star Wars uses footage from Star Wars is that that's a much more challenging thing to recreate on a very low budget to actually be able to do those kind of special effects. So let's just take those special effects and insert them into our film.
So that's using Hollywood against itself in a way that's it's okay. Well, we're literally going to use Hollywood.
We're actually going
to
use it this time.
Yeah, that's the jiu-jitsu. Yeah.
Whereas, a lot of the other films are, they're kind of, they're using the iconography. It's instantly recognizable. I think it's also it's part of the kind of intertextual nature of popular cinema that's always kind of borrowing from whatever is successful. I mean, Italy's, I guess, the most famous example of, okay, one film is, you get a spaghetti western is popular. 300 will be made the next year, and they'll just have a kind of cycle, a kind of Filoni kind of cycle of loads of films being produced by lots of competing producers. But I think that's true of so many popular industries around the world that just, one thing will be popular and successful, and then loads of small independent production companies will say, I can do that. Like, I can get that costume, I can do a version of that. And maybe I'll mix it with some other genres that we've worked in before. Yeah.
I wonder if it's also something to do with sort of cultural status. I mean, all these different cultural contexts I'm not familiar with, but when certainly, people forget that sort of horror, sci-fi, well, certainly horror and fantasy, 50s and 60s, where the era we're in, and even 70s, it isn't the staple of all the big budget franchises. It's not the things that people also can sort of do one of those and then you can go and play someone in a biopic and win an Oscar and then you can go back and be in the sequel. Like that career trajectory doesn't exist. It's much more schism, right? So I wonder if there's also something more available to this world to kind of filmmakers who want to make a more low budget, well, not want to, but are required to make a more low budget movie. There's something, less pedestal like about these genres that feel more available.
Definitely, yeah, and it's also like they're a huge part of these industries. So like if you look at Mexican cinema of that period, because there's the kind of golden age of Mexican cinema in like the 40s and 50s, and then in the kind of traditional accounts, there's often by the kind of 60s it's seen as a period of decline. It's a period in which lots of scholars would kind of ignore and put to one side in order to celebrate the great works from the two previous decades. And part of that is because almost 25% of the productions were horror, fantasy, and wrestling.
Right.
And there was a sense in which, there's a huge number of these kind of popular kind of films being produced, but they're not being put on a kind of pedestal. They're not being acclaimed. They're not from auteur directors. They're not part of, and they're not even seen as being part of a kind of authentic local culture because they're seen to be too heavily influenced by the outside. So I think that's one of the things that I think is starting to change now.
Yeah.
Is it too much one thing and not enough of the other? Yeah.
This is all very fascinating, but I'm aware we're about 2/3 of the way through this podcast at least, and we haven't mentioned that there's a fish man in this movie yet. So I think we're going to have to talk about that for a bit. So Dr. Williams, evil, bad guy. We're investigating him. Lots of sequences, lots of diving sequences, lots of chasing sequences. Turns out, Dr. Williams is. What's he doing?
He's draining the liquid from these pineal glands.
That's right.
Essentially, do some sort of symbiosis with a goldfish or something.
A goldfish or a human.
And you mentioned Stromberg, so you did kind of mention this.
Yes, I teased it.
This idea of creating a new civilization of fish people, fish men.
Yes.
That will bring, and I think I noted it down. Well, first of all, this the recollection of humanity's amphibious ancestors, but also the villainous monster is named Pisces. So
for only like the last 15 minutes of the movie, but absolutely, yes.
So essentially, that's it. It's a group of scientists want to create some.
That's it.
some fish-human hybrid to rid the land and create a new world underwater, essentially. And that accounts for the next half an hour.
Which means for the final sort of 20-25 minutes of the movie, it turns into Batwoman versus the Fish Man. So I don't know. I guess I'm struggling to find the language to articulate the pleasure I had with the movie. But part of it was this kind of genre flipping almost. Like, you know, whether is it fair to call it genre flipping if this is actually quite typical of Mexican movies? But certainly, as someone that's not seen these films, it felt like just when, okay, I'm sort of had enough of the diving stuff now and this sleuthing around. And there is quite a particularly effective sequence where she kind of boards the ship and like is looking around. It's quite tense and all that sort of stuff. But then like we've had about 25 minutes of that. We need something else. Let's freshen it up. Fishman comes and we get kind of creature feature kind of time. So is this quite typical, or is this?
I would say it is pretty typical. Where you're getting a mix of different genres, from wrestling, fantasy, horror, detectives, love stories, all kind of mixed together. So it is fairly kind of typical of kind of Mexican popular cinema. But I think this one's kind of distinctive in that sense of it, bringing together the kind of wrestling detective kind of element with a kind of mad scientist story. Because sometimes you get it's a more kind of gothic, kind of like all very heavily inspired by the Universal kind of Frankenstein and Dracula and that kind of series. So a lot of the kind of Santo wrestling films are like a mixture of the kind of Universal horror with Mexican wrestling. Whereas this film, it's the mad scientist story. That's
I mean, literally, well, at least in the subtitles, his assistant is called Igor. Like,
And does he? I sort of.
She throws
acid.
Yes.
I thought so because he also then starts to look.
So fish-like. I'm aware that we're gesturing a lot. So Batwoman throws acid at this Dr. Williams, and he gets a sort of burnt scar for the rest of the movie that he's very angry about and wants to enact vengeance on her.
We could go into a whole Bond disfigurement as villain. We're not going to go down, but there's a sort of I thought good kind of practical effects. I think the Fishman sort of sequences involving just a man in a costume are quite effective enough.
But the costume is quite well designed in that I'm assuming what's going on is that you've got a diver under there in like a tank and everything, and they managed to do very well to turn the tank into a kind of like fishy gill kind of, so it doesn't quite look so weird that there's this kind of protruding hulk at the back of his and there's when this Fishman is created and starts attacking her, like there are sequences where they fight underwater and all this sort of stuff, and it's I'm like there's obviously breathing apparatuses being hidden and things like that down there.
So is that what you mean about seeing the filmmaker? Like you're looking at I suppose there are lots of filmmaking traditions. Dogma is a good example. Out of constraint comes creativity, but I suppose I don't want to keep saying these kinds of films, but you know what I mean. The films that you write about and show Iain and restore, part of that awareness of seeing the filmmaker is presumably also heightened by the fact that these are effects movies as well. If this was a Mexican or Turkish adaptation of The Magnificent Ambersons, we wouldn't be seeing the filmmaker in the same kinds of ways. But the effects, and I think this is what Will Brown's talking about in relation to non-cinema, the idea of the effects, you can see that's where the craft and the handmade kind of comes in, and that exacerbates a process or a kind of a connoisseurship that we just generally have about special effects. But in this case, the effect is something slightly different because of your awareness of this being an unlicensed kind of copy. Like the effects are doing something to part of that process and the fascination of the films for you. Yes.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's also that sense that, like at this stage in his career, so the director René Cardona, he'd been making films in Mexico from the 30s. So he's originally from Cuba, went to the US, worked a little bit in Hollywood as a kind of assistant, and then come back to Mexico. So he's a long career. And so by this point, it's a very kind of well-honed kind of production machine. Yeah. Like they're even though they're working on very low budgets with very kind of limited resources, there's a kind of creativity in solving exactly the kinds of issues that you're describing, Alex, of where it's like, okay, how are we going to create this fish man? How are we going to make that look effective on screen? How are we going to hide the kind of diving apparatus? And so, it's all about finding solutions to those kinds of challenges. And of course, some of the effects don't quite come off, like the kind of little model of the
boat at the end.
Right, yeah.
Where it cuts and you're like, well, that's about a foot long.
So there's things where it's like, this doesn't quite work. But in general, like the quality is really great, and also and even those moments where it doesn't quite meet that, it still plays into that pleasure of seeing something that's handmade and crafted. It's you get it's something you get in loads of exploitation cinema. It's made by a kind of small production company with limited resources. You're seeing the process and the love that's gone into the production of, and that you don't necessarily see within films that have a bigger budget.
I mean, also
resources.
I've certainly seen Bond films with terrible minutes.
Yeah, and I think you're speaking my language because it's sort of to say something like, oh, well, that doesn't look very realistic, like, is to buy into the notion that there is a way of achieving a realistic-looking fish man.
That's just not it.
And that's just not it. Exactly, like there's some sort of universal quality of fish manness that this film isn't achieving. Which I don't really buy into. So, like, I think that whole kind of intellectual scaffolding of photorealism and good effects is something that's, really worth complicating and challenging. And these films kind of do that because they don't look like, you can see how they are made, but then I can see how a lot of big budget recent CGI special effects movies are made. Like, I know I can roughly work it out. Yeah. That doesn't, the pleasure is still there in these sequences. I can see how The Wizard of Oz is made, and it's an iconic, held up as a masterpiece in a way that this film probably isn't. It probably doesn't come on the same list.
Well,
probably.
Plenty of writers on kind of computer-generated imagery and the idea of and why the word wizardry often occurs in relation to CGI. And there's an article by Joseph Darlington about CGI wizardry that begins with something like, we all have a basic understanding of kind of how movies are made, and we know how we roughly know what cell animation is because of flipbooks, and we sort of know, and the digital is still something that we perhaps don't know, but
you can just about sort of picture.
Special features sort of get us there. So we're always knowing and not knowing.
Yeah,
we're often hesitating.
Thanks.
But we're always knowing and not knowing. It just seems that these movies. The Batwoman is different in only degree rather than kind of the kinds of thought processes one goes through when watching any superhero movie or animated film. Oh yeah, that's cool how they did that. I can see how they did that. That I haven't seen, but hey, visibility is To me, it's and when we've talked about the film, there are bits where we've sort of been a bit incredulous about. Okay, and then there's a fish man, but it all comes from a place of love and sincerity because I think the film treats its subject matter like that too.
So there's a fish man,
sure.
This is obviously now where I'd like to talk about gender because I think we set up. I don't know. I'd like to just toss this around for a bit. We set up at the beginning. I think there's something very interesting with gender in this movie. She is the hero of the film. She is the one that's physically capable, intellectually more capable than most of the characters. She drives the plot. There is something slightly weird that starts to happen as soon as the fish man arrives, and I'm not quite sure what it is, but there seems to be something that the film doesn't like the idea that she can easily defeat a fish man. So as soon as the fish man comes in, we see her get on the ship, she beats up 6 goons, she solves the mystery, she's very, very capable for about 2/3 of this movie. And then when the monster is attacking her, not only does fear become registered on her face for the first time, but we get far more prominent involvement of this kind of male Mario sidekick guy. So we get a sequence where she encounters this fish man underwater, she escapes, climbs onto the boat, and it's Mario that actually stops the sort of does something with fire, doesn't he? And like sets fire to the sort of oil barrels or something like that and keeps the fish man away. Mm-hmm. And then we get this kind of final climactic moment, or sort of a final climactic moment, where the fish man attacks them at their home. And again, the film wants to kind of have her as the kind of the poster girl that the monster carries away. They kind of want to put her as Frey Ray in King Kong, whilst also keeping her as Batwoman. I don't know. Did anyone else?
I was thinking Caligari, the bit where Cesare is like walking into the room, climbing the walls, and kind of that was.
But at the same time, she's sort of. So there's this bit. So there's a plot point where the fish man there's like a siren, you kind of a bit of tech, isn't there? Where the fishman, wherever you put the thing, the fishman will attack that. Right, is basically it. And she discovers, and they put it on her. They put on her Batwoman cape, and she discovers it, and then purposely kind of wears it and keeps it. And there's something very interesting going on in that moment. That's like, come at me, like it will bring. And she says, like, I did it because it will bring the enemies to us, and then we can fight them. But I didn't anticipate it being a monster. So I wonder if there's something about the limitations of feminine agency when encountering kind of bestiality or monstrosity that this film, it can't quite envision a world where she can just beat up the fishman.
No, I think that's a good observation. Yeah, because the film seems to want to indulge in the kind of the woman being attacked by the monster or being carried away by the monster, and to have some of that imagery and to have some of those moments within the narrative that then, of course, it undercuts so many of the much more kind of progressive kind of sexual politics of the film that you get up till those points. Like I think part of it does seem to be that attempt to kind of recreate elements of the kind of monster movie in which the woman is being attacked by the monster or being carried away by the monster, and then it just doesn't quite fit with much of the rest of the film.
But is that, I mean, from your knowledge of these other scholarship around these films, are these kinds of plots read allegorically as a sort of for this kind of cinema that's there's a way in which the reworkings of particular characters and intellectual properties and mythologies are done in such a way as to be read metaphorically for the national cinema that is itself resistant and reworking? Because it seems like a lot of some of the legitimizations around kind of art cinema is that I was probably, I know you made this point in relation to fantasy, like that you justify it by reading it politically, like that's it's not just throwaway, because actually what it is a damning indictment of the government in 1964 or something like this. So I just wondered, is that a trap that one falls into when engaging with these films, that actually a lot of people, or maybe for good reason, evaluate their narratives and their characters and what they're doing with this kind of mythology and these characters through a kind of political, it's an allegory for third cinema, or just that kind of thing?
No, I think it's a big challenge, because I teach a class on exploitation cinema for our MA students here, and one of the things that we always find encountering with the students is the question of, well, what do we do with these films? Because we can't use the kinds of skills that we use when we're talking about art cinema and kind of celebrated canonical kind of auteur cinema, because we can't really read them through a kind of the political intent of the filmmaker, or so then what do we do with the films? Do we do close textual analysis of the meaning of the films, but then can we get beyond a surface level kind of reading? And then, of course, as you say, it then becomes, let's read it as a kind of national allegory. Maybe that's the way of legitimizing our kind of reading, which I'm fairly kind of in most cases unconvinced by. And so I wouldn't want to try and present a kind of reading of the Batwoman. But I think it's a good
You're unconvinced by it because that's not the historical reality. You're unconvinced by it because you don't think the text supports it. You're not unconvinced by it because it's not interesting. No,
that's
all of them.
All of them.
A little bit of all of them. I mean, I think part of it is that I don't feel that the text supports it. I mean, I think it's something that I found. I did a screening of the Turkish Star Wars to some of my colleagues in the film department here, who, it's not really the kind of film that they would watch normally, and much of the response was part of...
I'm picturing some of the people who I know are in this film department, and they're probably listening, but I'm laughing at the idea of them watching that movie.
I mean, I think, it's not normally the film that they would kind of choose to put on, or to think and analyse, and then, but they were struggling with exactly that problem of, I want to do a political reading of this in terms of kind of Turkish politics in the early 1980s, or I'm wanting to read this, and there's a kind of religious elements within the film. Is there a kind of deeper meaning that I can understand?
Sure.
But then a lot of those elements are contradictory and inconsistent. There isn't a kind of coherent message that we can kind of discern. And so, that's one of the things that I've kind of struggled with in my work, is to try and think through work that pays close attention to the text, but then isn't kind of, reading the films for those kind of broader kind of political meanings.
Yeah, but also the kinds of narrative beats or characters or themes to which one could attach political readings are not and I think that Thomas Alsasser kind of makes this point when he's talking about noir, is that the thing there are not intrinsic things, or the things that we think are intrinsic to film noir that we can trace back to the German influence on noir, actually are true of other influences. We've just sort of honed in on them in the German context. So in this case, the things that make these films political are, I mean, it's not too dissimilar from some of the Hollywood superhero movies in terms of, but we don't read those politically, even in the same way. It seems like certain kinds of cinema lends itself to certain kinds of political readings, because of course it must be about that, because of the struggles that part of the world has gone through, or so it seems like the beats that are included in this film, by virtue of the fact that it's a kind of adaptation, reworking, there is a sense that it does link quite clearly to some of the Hollywood productions, but one wouldn't read the Hollywood productions in the same kind of political way than we perhaps would the Philippine version, because of issues around national trauma that we attach, which is again a very sort of kind of colonial mindset, thinking about, okay, so to justify national cinema must be to understand that cinema or that art or that form of cultural production's relationship to trauma, because that's all they've got.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, this is perhaps a boring thing to say, so listeners, you might not be listening to this bit, but like, you know, in that classic, you know, so everything's political. So actually, isn't it about finding, rather than trying to map onto these films some sort of outside politics or politics with a capital P in terms of some sort of national narrative or social narrative, it's the quiet politics of choosing to make a Batwoman movie in 1967 in Mexico, or choosing to on that day, on that set, because you had the costume available, add a subplot involving a fishman, choosing to disregard the worry about continuity because, hey, it'll be fun if we put this wrestling sequence in. These are all quiet political acts that are more about kind of pleasure and aesthetic contracts with assumed spectators that are worth teasing out. I think that's what you do very well in your work.
No, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do, because I think, political is a kind of interesting word, because I think on some level, I'm not someone who tries to do a kind of allegorical reading of the kind of intended political statement of the filmmaker, which I think often doesn't hold up, or these texts don't really allow you to take that kind of approach. But I am someone who's very interested in the cultural politics of these films being produced, and the kind of larger kind of global kind of political dynamics that are leading to these films happening. This fact that, like, it is very political that all of these reworkings of Batman are being made all around the world, and that is a political fact. Like, it's something that is shaped by American kind of pop culture kind of hegemony around the world, the power of Hollywood, the power of, you know, American cinema and music, and yet also the power and the agency of filmmakers appropriating elements from that and making their own films out of that material. I think that's I guess that's the distinction in my head, is that I'm interested in that politics. I'm not so interested in kind of reading the political statement that the film is making, because I think the films often don't work in that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think as a sort of means of a closure, like, I think the experience of watching it today gave us, well, at least I'm sure it gave Chris as well, because we're chatting about it, like a snapshot into the fascination of your work, which is this kind of, almost it's the having the courage to try and be with the film and not bring kind of all the baggage of different modes of reception that you might have developed in a kind of pristine Hollywood context to try to find ways to deride it or try to find ways to appreciate it ironically and all this sort of stuff. So to kind of be with the film, and then once you've done that, to kind of ask what that asks you to unlearn, almost like about how a film can be good. So really, really interesting, and thanks for bringing Batwoman in. I have a final question. To Ian about dubbing. We didn't watch the dub version. We watched a subtitle version, although it was dubbed in the sense that a lot of these films, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that these films, the audio is rarely recorded live on set, right? It's sort of dubbed after, and you can often see an imperfection. This is true of lots of these movies, right? So what's your thoughts on dubbing? Because I'm actually slightly growing of the opinion that people can be quite snobby about dubbing, and actually there is a problem with subtitling, and there's a problem with dubbing, and there's a virtue to subtitling, and there's a virtue to dubbing, and I'm sort of getting to the point where I'm like, each to your own. But do you have would you prefer people watch the subtitled version? I'm assuming there are English language dubbed versions out there. What's your thoughts on that?
I think, I guess like you, I'm kind of I question the ways in which dubbing, especially in a kind of UK US context, is seen so kind of negatively, and so subtitling is associated with art cinema, with kind of a sense of taking something seriously.
Reading is good for you.
Whereas dubbing is associated with popular cinemas. It's associated with Italian cinema, Hong Kong cinema, Mexican cinema. So you've got a lot of these kind of Mexican films from the 60s were bought up and dubbed into English for US television. So K. Gordon Murray, Jerry Warren, who the wild Batwoman film that was sued. He after making that film, he bought up loads of films and dubbed and recut them for US distribution. But a lot of the time, the dubbing helps these films reach an audience who wouldn't otherwise be watching them. There's that tension around cult where it's like, they're not taking the film seriously and they're not appreciating them. But often that initial engagement, I think, can lead to a more kind of sustained engagement over time. So there's often this sense of like, people are watching a kind of badly dubbed copy and they're laughing, and therefore that individual act is kind of problematic and it's not really engaging seriously with Mexican cinema. But my experience is that initial engagement does often lead into something more sustained over time, and I think dubbing is often a way that these films do kind of reach audiences who might otherwise be quite resistant.
I mean, just on a very practical level, it also means you can keep more of your eyes on the screen and more on your eyes on the stuff, the filmmaking, the kind of the beauty of some of the shots, the composition and things like that. So there's just, I'm sort of coming around to dubbing as as well, particularly, again, talking about unlearning stuff, right? It assumes a kind of synergy of voice to physical performance that it's just not true of these movies anyway. So and it assumes the dubbing will be bad as well, right? Well, actually, it's the subtitling can be bad, right?
Well, exactly. I think in being involved in some kind of subtitling of films more recently, that has really kind of opened my eyes to the limitations of subtitling, the ways in which it's often perceived as being, this is a more accurate, authentic version. Like I am listening to the original language and I'm reading the subtitles, therefore I'm understanding this film in a way that I'm not getting from the dub. But actually, a lot of the time, those subtitles are there's mistranslations, there's things that they've not quite been able to capture in the amount of words and space they've got. Yeah. So actually, a lot of the time, it's not a better translation. It's just a different way of engaging with that process.
Cool. Well, actually, that speaks to, I guess we were going to ask you, or teased at the start, we were going to ask you about some of your kind of future work around restoration and stuff like this. So, people can check out your profile on King's, Star profile on the King's website, and they will see all of the publications, but they'll also see the screenings that you've put on and sort of trying to do sort of events at particular cultural institutions around London and beyond that are involved in giving these films, or I want to say reclaiming these films, but giving these films a different kind of audience. So you're interested in restoring and bringing some of these films, these quote unquote lost films or hidden films, to light.
Yeah, so I think the first one for me was the Turkish Star Wars. So Dünyayı Kurtaran Adam. We got a 35mm print of the film, which was the kind of last remaining one known to be in circulation, and we
I've got one. You could have had that.
So we did, we sent it over to the American Genre Film Archive. They did like a kind of 2K scan. We did some kind of restoration work, and then of course that then played at film festivals. It came out on Blu-ray, so that film is now, people can watch an HD version of the film that for a long time was just a kind of